I stood silently in front of my parents' graves, my hand shaking as I clutched the $500. 0 cents, 0 cents. Fine. They had been buried for 3 years, and the HOA had still issued a ticket for non-compliance with lawn mowing regulations. The cold way, she said. The rules are the rules. Made my chest tighten, not because of the pain of loss, but because of her arrogant stubbornness. She thought I would collapse and would stay silent, but she didn't know, at that moment, I had decided that no one would trample on my parents' memory. And then I would launch the most costly counterattack of her life. I am David Miller, 28 years old, and I have just returned to Maple Ridge after burying my parents to sort through their possessions and decades of memories. The old two-story house where I grew up sits quietly on Elm Street, its white picket fence now chipped and small yard overgrown with weeds. Margaret Stevens, 38 years old, with short, perfectly styled blonde hair, had come to our quiet neighborhood 5 years ago from some unknown big city, immediately positioning herself as the self-appointed guardian of property values and community standards. What she didn't know, what no one in Maple Ridge knew, was what I had done before the psychological warfare began, exactly 24 hours after my parents' funeral, when Margaret appeared at my front door, clutching an official-looking clipboard and wearing that signature white shirt pressed to perfection. "I'm terribly sorry for your loss, David," she said with practiced sympathy, "but I'm afraid the property has already accumulated several violations." She handed me a $200, 0 cents fine for weeds that had grown beyond the mysterious 6 in regulation I'd never heard of in 28 years of living here. "Mrs. Stevens, I just buried my parents yesterday," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm still processing the estate. Could I possibly have some time to address these issues?" Her expression shifted from fake sympathy to business-like coldness in an instant. "Regulations are regulations, Mr. Miller. Grief doesn't exempt anyone from community standards. You have exactly 72 hours." The way she emphasized exactly while adjusting her clipboard told me this wasn't about property maintenance at all. Margaret returned 3 days later with reinforcements, this time accompanied by a man she introduced as OA Compliance Officer Jenkins. Though he looked more like hired muscle than any official I'd ever met, she presented me with a $350 0 cents fine for improper trash bin placement and failure to maintain curb appeal standards when I pointed out that our bins had occupied the same spot beside the garage for 2 decades. Margaret produced a freshly printed regulation book that still smelled like printer toner of last month. All refuge containers must be positioned no less than 15 feet from the street and no more than 3 feet from the residence. She read mechanically, "You weren't present at the community meeting where this was voted on, so naturally you wouldn't be aware of the changes." I noticed she kept glancing at her phone and checking the time, but she had somewhere more important to be. Mrs. Peterson from next door had mentioned something about Margaret's husband being a prominent lawyer in the city, though. In 5 years, nobody had ever actually seen this mysterious spouse. The public humiliation campaign launched the following week when Margaret organized what she called an emergency community standards meeting right there on my front lawn. She'd invited the entire neighborhood to witness what she dramatically termed a textbook example of how property neglect affects everyone's home values. About 20 neighbors gathered on the sidewalk while Margaret, resplendent in her crisp white shirt and armed with a megaphone she'd somehow procured, delivered a speech about community responsibility and property maintenance obligations. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, gesturing toward my house like a prosecutor presenting evidence, "this is precisely what happens when residents choose to disregard the community standards that protect all of our investments." She read from her clipboard a detailed list of my supposed infractions, from grass height to mailbox positioning to the color of my garden hose. Mrs. Peterson looked mortified. Mr. Martinez shook his head in disgust, but Several newer residents nodded along with Margaret's performance. I stood in my doorway, feeling the weight of judgment from people who'd known my family for decades. But Margaret's master stroke came when she handed me that $500. 0 cents citation addressed directly to my deceased parents, John and Mary Miller. Failure to maintain landscaping standards as required by HOA Regulation Section 4.7. She read aloud for the entire gathering to hear, but they've been dead for 3 years. I said, my voice cracking with a mixture. Margaret didn't even blink. According to property law, the estate remains responsible for all violations until title transfer is complete. As the heir, you bear full legal responsibility for their compliance failures. That evening, I started digging into HOA records and discovered something that made my federal investigator instinct start tingling. Margaret had modified the community regulations 6 times in just the past 2 months, each change coincidentally creating new violations for properties she seemed to be targeting. None of these modifications had gone through proper voting procedures, and several directly contradicted the original HOA charter that had governed our neighborhood for 30 years. The isolation campaign began with a neighbor-wide letter that Margaret personally delivered to every mailbox on Elm Street. Dear residents, it began, recent events have demonstrated that certain community members choose to disregard the standards that maintain our property values and neighborhood quality. Please consider carefully before engaging with households that consistently violate community regulations. Within days, neighbors who'd brought casseroles to my parents' funeral were crossing the street to avoid making eye contact. People who'd known me since I was 5 years old suddenly found urgent reasons to end conversations when I approached. The loneliness was suffocating, exactly as Margaret had calculated. She'd weaponized my grief and turned my childhood neighborhood into a hostile environment where I felt like an unwelcome stranger. But she'd made one critical error in her psychological warfare. She'd assumed I was just another grieving son who'd roll over and accept her authority. She had no idea she was dealing with someone who'd spent 15 years investigating federal workplace violations and taking down corrupt officials who thought they were untouchable. Margaret's legal intimidation phase launched when she arrived with a man in an expensive, dark suit who she introduced as our legal counsel, Mr. Harrison. They threatened a $5,000 0 cents lawsuit and forced sale of my property if I didn't immediately comply with all HOA demands. Who exactly do you think you are to challenge duly constituted community authority? Margaret demanded, her voice rising with apparent righteous indignation. But when I asked to see Mr. Harrison's bar certification and legal authorization to represent the HOA, both of them exchanged nervous glances, and the supposed lawyer hurried away without another word that night. I received a phone